This is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we're talking with Hans von Spakovsky, frequent PJM contributor, former Federal Election Commission and Justice Department official, and the co-author, along with John Fund of National Review, of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. It's published by Encounter Books and available from Amazon.com and your local bookstore. And Hans, thank you for stopping by today.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me on.
Hans, I want to begin with an actual headline in Slate, the liberal website owned by the Washington Post, in an article written on October 16, 2008, by Dahlia Lithwick. Quote, "Believing in vote fraud may be dangerous to a democracy's health," unquote. How did we get to the point where one side of the aisle, on a website owned by the newspaper that made its bones doggedly pursuing Watergate and other scandals, tut-tuts not just worrying about voter fraud, but simply believing in it?
Well, there's just this false narrative that's being pushed by the left, and they're pushing it because they don't want to admit that voter fraud actually happens in American elections, and because they don't want any of the measures that people are trying to put in place, like voter ID, to be passed. And so they push this totally ridiculous claim and idea. And look, they're particularly frustrated because look at the polling. The American public completely disagrees with it and just isn't buying it. Americans as a whole, doesn't matter what race or background, all believe voter fraud is an issue that we should be concerned about, and they all think, for example, that election reform like voter ID is a good idea.
Well, Hans, what's your response to complaints from the left that discouraging voter fraud is actually an attempt to suppress minority voters?
Well, look, there's an easy answer to that because states like Georgia and Indiana, for example, they've had voter ID laws in place for more than 5 years. The laws were upheld in the courts. They've had numerous elections, and the actual certified election returns from those states show that not only did the turnout of, for example, Democrats and African Americans not go down, it actually increased dramatically in those states after their voter ID laws went into place.
Do liberals not see the oddity of a system that requires us to show an ID to drive a car, to buy beer, to get on an airplane, et cetera, but not at the voting booth?
No, they just take this completely foolish position and keep pushing it, and they just want to be in denial about the fact that you need ID for so many other things, including, by the way, look, if you're poor, you're going to need ID to do things like apply for Medicaid, apply for food stamps, all kinds of things which they are claiming, poor people can't do because they don't have photo ID. That's not actually the reality of the real world.
Why are some states able to successfully pass voter ID laws, and yet others try, but they simply can't get voter ID into law?
Well, the biggest opponents to these laws have been Democrats. Their constituents don't agree with them. The polling shows that. But, some of them actually have come around. Rhode Island, for example, did pass a photo ID law. That's a state entirely controlled by Democrats, and it was actually a African-American Democratic state senator who had personal experience with voter fraud, who was the chief sponsor of that bill. Kansas is another state that, although the bill was sponsored by Republicans, a majority of Democrats actually agreed to the need for the law and voted for its final passage.
Election Day of 2008 highlighted the new Black Panthers' attempt to intimidate Philadelphia area voters, including brandishing billy clubs at the entrance to a polling place. We ran numerous posts and articles on that case here at PJM. What was its ultimate denouement?
That case, unfortunately, was dismissed by the Holder Justice Department, even though they had already won the case, because the political appointees did not consider two guys in black paramilitary outfits, one of them carrying a nightstick and hurling racial epithets at voters, to be voter intimidation. Compare that to the fact that we had civil rights organizations getting very upset recently when billboards were put up simply pointing out that voter fraud is a violation of law and claiming that that was voter intimidation.
And if I'm recalling correctly, the video of the new Black Panthers was something that originally appeared on YouTube. Is that correct?
It did, and you don't often, as a federal prosecutor, get a case where you've got clear video evidence of what happened, and yet even with that, the Holder Justice Department dismissed the case. We now know the reason they did that was because they do not believe in race-neutral enforcement of our voting rights laws. They don't believe it should be used to prosecute, for example, black defendants who engage in voter intimidation or voting discrimination, and that was why they dismissed the case.
In the review of the new documentary Hating Breitbart, written by Nick Gillespie of Reason magazine, Gillespie notes that, quote, at more than one point in the movie, Breitbart asks members of the audience he's addressing to hold up their iPhones, pocket cams, and other recording devices and to turn them on. You, Breitbart says, are the media. Does that same Army of David spirit also allow individuals to be better poll watchers as well?
It does, although, unfortunately, some states, at the behest of election officials, have gotten so upset at that very idea that they have banned people taking photographs inside polling places. I don't agree with those kind of statutes, but that's an unfortunate consequence. On the other hand, look, it's only because of James O'Keefe and his undercover videos that have caught people trying to engage in voter fraud that has done things like brought down ACORN, which was one of the worst organizations in terms of voter registration fraud in the history of the United States.
And one more question. Well, actually, one more two-part question on 2008. How did voting fraud impact the Minnesota race between Norm Coleman and Al Franken in 2008? And how did the election of a former Saturday Night Live writer to the Senate have ramifications for the entire nation?
Well, that was a case where voter fraud, election fraud, actually affected every person in the United States. Contrary to what the left says, that there's no voter fraud, it doesn't affect elections. A court declared Al Franken the winner in that race by a little over 300 votes out of 2.9 million cast. We now know that almost 1,100 felons voted illegally in that election. That's 4 times the margin of victory. How did that election fraud affect Americans? Well, Al Franken was the 60th vote that helped pass Obamacare. And it's very clear that he would not have been elected if those felons had not been able to vote illegally, because data shows that felons by a majority vote Democratic.
Hans, let's talk about the 2012 election in our last couple of minutes. What do you make of the reports that Matt Drudge has recently been highlighting, where voters have occasionally seen their votes on touchscreens switch from Romney to Obama?
Well, that's probably the result of poor testing and maintenance by local election officials. They're voting on touchscreen voting machines. Those are similar to iPads. They're similar to the whiteboards that students and teachers use. Those have to be very carefully calibrated so that the screen, what appears on the screen, corresponds with where you touch it. And if that is out of calibration, you're going to get the kind of problems people have been reporting.
Glenn Reynolds of Instapundit.com has long been a champion of good old-fashioned paper ballots. Do you think that that's a better method for voting than the high-tech touchscreens?
Yeah, I actually think that OptiScan ballots, those are the paper ballots that you fill out by hand and then they're scanned by a computer and counted. That's the best kind of equipment because you've got an audit trail. If somebody disagrees with the computer totals that are done through scanning, you've got the paper ballots as a backup to count the votes and make sure that you've got the correct results for the election. I think that's the best way to vote.
Hans, we're recording this interview on Friday afternoon, November 2nd. What's your prediction as to how Election Day will play out, and how quickly or how slowly will we know who the next president of the United States will be?
If there is a significant margin of victory, we will know very quickly. If the margin of victory is very close, as many of the polls seem to indicate, then it could be delayed quite some time, because what will happen is if we have states, particularly battleground states, where the margin of victory is smaller than the number of provisional ballots that have been handed out, Provisional ballots are counted and looked at after Election Day, when election officials determine whether or not the person really was eligible to vote or whether there was some kind of problem and whether those ballots should be counted. If you get hundreds of thousands of provisional ballots, it will take quite a while for election officials to go through each and every one of those.
Define quite a while. Are we talking late November, into December?
It could be into December if lawyers from both campaigns get involved and start contesting the decisions being made by local officials on each provisional ballot. Then you're going to get the exact replica of the situation we had in Florida in 2000, where lawyers were arguing over every single ballot and whether it should be counted or not.
Now there's something to look forward to.
I know you're being facetious when you say that.
Well, on that potentially depressing note, this is Ed Driscoll for PJmedia.com, and we've been talking with Hans von Spakovsky, frequent PJM contributor, and the co-author, along with John Fund of National Review, of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. It's published by Encounter Books, and it's available from Amazon.com and your local bookstore. And Hans, thank you once again for stopping by today, and keep up the great work, keeping them honest.
Well, thank you, Ed. It was great talking to you.